Okay. Good morning. Buenos dias, everyone. I'm so excited to see you all here. Look at this, 262 participants and climbing. I love so many folks are here today. Yes, Jackie, this is definitely healing. It brings me hope. I don't know on which side of your screen my hope sign is up, but this definitely gives me hope. Again, buenos dias, good morning. My name is Alejandra Aguilar, gender pronouns she, her, hers. I lead the statewide prevention program at the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, also known as the Partnership for short. We are so excited that you are all here, committed to this conversation about ending racial injustice and the intersection between racial justice and the prevention of intimate partner violence and sexual violence. For those who are just joining in the chat, we are adding our name, gender pronouns, organization we are representing, if any, our role, and what would you like to get out of today, if anything is coming up for you all. This session is being recorded, and we are very excited for you all to be here. I want to share a little bit of how we got here before we jump on to our first presenter. This conversation is long overdue. We had a conversation last week with preventionists from across the state. We had over 100 preventionists join separately in conversations around how folks are feeling, what is going on at their organizations in response to the incredibly painful and hurtful murders of Black folks at the hands of police officers, law enforcement, and white supremacists. Folks were speaking up about the frustrations of maybe some organizations not being able to make a statement in favor of Black lives due to fear of losing funding, or fear of losing a donor, or perhaps a fear of losing a board member. And these are very real fears that exist across the domestic violence and sexual violence field. The lack of unrestricted funds is a very real fear. And today we are going to be discussing with Tanji and Kolsaria, how can organizations move beyond those fears? How do we center on our values and our mission? The majority of us have a mission to end domestic violence and sexual violence, and our values of being committed to all people, especially marginalized folks. So what does that look like when we center on racial justice? And we were hearing from folks that were saying that there are times when they hear from board members or leadership that, nope, DV orgs and rape crisis centers cannot be talking about racial justice. We cannot be talking about gun violence. We cannot be talking about immigrant issues, because this is not an issue about domestic violence or sexual violence. That's their issue. And today we are addressing why it is our issue to speak up for racial justice. It is our issue to stand with Black lives. This is about the prevention of relationship and sexual violence, and it requires that we all get involved. As preventionists, we are constantly speaking up about bystander engagement and what that looks like. And most of us know the D's, right? The be direct, the delay, the delegate. And I remember that 4 years ago, we used to have the other D, do nothing. And we took that one off purposefully, because do nothing means you are okay with what is going on, with the violence that is taking place. And we are not okay with that. That is not bystander engagement. So most of us, when we speak about bystander intervention and bystander engagement, we do not talk about the do nothing anymore, because that is not an option for any of us. We can find safe alternatives. We can find options that are most comfortable to ourselves and our safety, but doing nothing is not an option. That is why we are here, to engage in this conversation with all of us, because we want to walk away with tools, language, resources that will help all of us engage our leadership staff, engage our board of directors, engage our funders and donors, our community members in conversations around racial justice, because it is an issue of prevention. So thank you all so much for being here. I feel hopeful. It fills my heart with hope that we are moving in the right direction to make radical changes across our organizations. I have been reading so much about I've been reading the book Unapologetic, a Black, Queer, and Feminist Mandate for Radical Movements. That was my first step. I am not a Black woman. I am a Mexicana, formerly undocumented. That is my experience. I do not know what it means or what it feels to be a Black woman, a Black person in this country. So I am doing my work. I am reading, I am asking questions, and today I will be facilitating this conversation. If you have any questions that you would like to ask, please use your chat. I will add the title of the book into the chat. Thank you. It is a phenomenal read. It is my second time around. I love it. We'll also add some reading recommendations at the end. I will jot that down. You can add questions through the chat. You can send that over to me personally. So where it says the chat to everyone, that means everybody sees it. If you want to just go to me, you can add Alejandra Aguilar and it will go just to me. If you have a question specifically for Tanji or specifically for Kosaria, you can do that as well. Now I would like to introduce Tanji, who is going to be leading the first part of our conversation. Folks, you are going to be blown away. Tanji is a Detroit native, creative, preventionist, and founder of 1124, a program dedicated to reimagining prevention through a lens of liberation and community. In her many years of youth serving and gender-based violence at work, she has held roles as a prevention program director, national community initiatives coordinator, and senior program officer. Tanji holds a BS in behavioral science and an MA in education, leadership, and change. Driven by the belief that everyone has a role in gender-based violence prevention, her motto is, "It's up to us to define what our role will be." We are so excited to have you here today, Tanji. We are so excited to hear from you, to learn from you. I am ready, so I will hand it on over to you.
All right, thank you, and thank you for that introduction. Give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so as Alejandra said, thank you all so much for being here. It's really interesting. I've been having conversations like this for really a long time. Honestly, since I started doing this work, I was introduced to it through learning about oppression and how it relates to relationship abuse and sexual violence. And it's really refreshing to see that we're really starting to make those movements forward. And I hope that this is not a moment and not something that is temporary, but something that's more long lasting and is integrated in all of the work that you do. So just by being here today, you are showing that this is not a moment for you, that you are intentional about your learning. So thank you so much for being here. And so, like in the introduction, you heard just a little bit about my background and what I do. And through 1124, and a lot of the trainings that I do and a lot of the workshops that I do are really centering this, because I feel like prevention really is that key to a lot of what we need to do to eliminate not just relationship abuse and sexual violence, but also to combat things like poverty issues that we don't often address and associate with it, and homophobia and transphobia that happen, xenophobia that happen. So I have just a few things to share to start us off, and then if you all have questions during or afterwards, then we'll discuss and talk about them. So to start off, I want to share this quote by Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the phrase intersectionality. And she says, if we aren't intersectional, some of us, the most vulnerable, are going to fall through the cracks. And we know who that most vulnerable are. In a TED Talk that she did when she explained intersectionality, she talked about the Black girls and women that have been killed by police officers, but we don't really hear about them in the news. Like right now, we're hearing Breonna Taylor's name, but there's also Rakia Boyd and Sandra Bland, whose names that we had heard before, but kind of were forgotten. And so that is really what happened. That at that point, it becomes even harder to remember those. So we have to really keep Black girls and women at the forefront from the beginning. And that's really how I want to frame this, is by talking about the experiences of Black girls and women and what that means for relationship abuse and sexual violence prevention. So imagine that this young person is someone that you're working with. She is someone maybe in a school that you work with, in a community program or however, and her identities are all intersecting. So she is facing things because she identifies as Black, she identifies as young, she identifies as female, and let's say she also identifies as low income, which isn't a reality for all young Black people, but let's say for her, this is her reality. For most places, they're only able to support and serve what issues fit on each lane. So some places are only able to support and serve the fact that she's Black. Some places are only able to support and serve the fact that she identifies as female. Some people only serve young people, and some people only serve folks with lower income. But when you intersect all these things together, that really needs to be where the support is. When you're giving support services for domestic abuse and sexual violence, you have to also consider how that person's age, their gender, and their race intersect, and how that affects risk for sexual violence, but also their ability to get support afterwards. But when we're talking about prevention, we have to think about what those things look like in the world and realm of a young person. So a lot of times with prevention programming, we'll use things like gender stereotypes to talk about power and control, and how women and girls are taught to be quiet and to be nice and soft and sweet, and boys and men are taught to be tough, not to cry, to be into sports, and be overly aggressive. And we talk about how those gender stereotypes affect the way that people see themselves and others. But what we miss is that based on a person's racial identity, they get different stereotypes. So on top of being expected to be nice and sweet and kind and soft and passive, Black girls and women are also expected to be strong and sassy and loud and aggressive. That even comes out as a harmful name. So Black girls and women are again taught to are seen or stereotyped as being loud, angry. People can use names like hood rat, which is a very racialized name that someone can be called. Oreo. So if someone is Black, but people don't think that they act Black on the outside, being overly sexual, ghetto, nappy-headed, strong, sassy, and more adult. So there's this stereotype on Black girls too of adultification, where people assume that Black girls know more, do more, are more aggressive, and as a result are punished harshly. There's a study by Georgetown Law that talks about how Black girls are pushed out of schools and are punished more harshly in schools. And if we think about it, where do most of our prevention programs happen? Pre-pandemic, we were a lot of times in schools. I know that's where I got my start, is going into schools and doing educational programming in schools. But what I started to learn when talking about gender stereotypes is it's not all, what we were talking about wasn't always relatable. And a lot of those stereotypes that Black girls were getting were harmful. It was a lot of these. So imagine being a young Black girl who's in school, and you're in school, and the people who are around you, the adults that are supposed to be there to protect and support you, have these stereotypes about you, or have these feelings that you should act this way or be this way just because of your racial identity. So they expect you to be more aggressive. And as a result, Black girls are punished harsher, and schools start to feel unsafe, and then they're pushed out of schools. And that's when generations of low income start to happen more. That's when people get pushed into sex work and trafficking and being over policed in their communities. So really, all of this is rooted in how we view people and how we view people based off of identities. We all hold some type of racial bias, and sometimes those racial biases can come through how we do our work. And it starts with those stereotypes. So we can't really make a big change unless we're addressing those stereotypes that we hold and have and confronting them and making them plain and real. Because not only can Black girls experience sexual violence and relationship abuse because of their essence of being a girl or a woman, they can also face racism, microaggressions, prejudice, or even be killed. This doesn't change when they're in their communities either. And this is where like that over policing comes in. So a person can be feeling okay in their community around their people, but then that over surveillance can make it feel even more unsafe. With these stereotypes, it takes away a Black girl or woman's ability to have personal agency over their body or ability to feel like they can move freely and safely throughout the world. So we know that at the root of relationship abuse and sexual violence is power and privilege. We talk about power and control as being a root. We have to realize that power is not solely happening in interpersonal relationships. That power dynamic is there in a societal way too. So people who are in like this middle age range have more power than folks that are younger and older. We know that there's societal power that men have. We know there's societal power that folks that are not LGBTQ have. We know that there is religious social power. And I think that we have to also think about how we talk about power and control too, and what that means when you're talking to young Black folks, young Black kids especially. If we teach them that power is all bad, then they may already feel like the power that they're not getting in the societal way is there. So they might do things to try to get more of that power back. That's when we start to see some of those behavioral, those stereotypes people expect to have, because people want to, in some ways, maybe meet that expectation, but also feel like they have to have their voice seen and heard. That's why we have to lean more towards empowering young people in marginalized communities and young people of color, especially Black kids, and teach them that it's more about personal agency. That power and privilege, again, also comes up when we think about police brutality. Those same police officers that view Black girls as being more aggressive also are the ones who are answering calls to domestic and sexual abuse situations. So they can hold those same type of attitudes and those same stereotypes. And that's why prevention is not only about someone stopping relationship abuse and sexual violence, it's about culture shift and creating differences of attitudes. Because not only do we want people to not be in abusive relationships, we also want that the people that respond to them to respond with safety and understanding and belonging and care. And that can't happen when people hold on to stereotypes that are harmful. So I like to think that we have to engage in identity affirmation. So not even just acknowledging the fact that people have different experiences, that there are a unique set of stereotypes that people get based off of their race, but also do it in a way that is affirming. So with identity affirmation, it confirms who a person is. It gives them space to assert themselves within their community. And it recognizes the values, traditions, beliefs, and cultural practices that they hold and give honor to them and respect them. And that can create positive feelings, especially among young people when they feel that sense of belonging or feel like they are part of it and don't feel that othering. It also provides us the opportunity to be intentionally intersectional and have more opportunities for access to communities that we may not have it. Identity affirmation also validates young people and leads them to a path of self-recognition and personal agency. You can't really teach about healthy relationships or teach about consent or coercion if you aren't affirming the identity of young people and recognizing that their experiences may be different because of their racial background and the community they come from. And not doing it in a way where you feel like you want to save them, but doing it in a way where I see you and I hear you and I don't want you to have this experience. Sometimes, too, I think it's harmful when we talk about disproportionate race without actually examining why rates are so disproportionate among black girls and women. So we have to really think about what equality, equity, and liberation mean. So for equality, that means that people get the same opportunities. We saw this in like the 1960s civil rights movement, where people were just wanting the same rights and opportunities. We've moved past that. We've moved past equality. We have to move past equality. And then we start to talk more about equity. So that means that there's additional support for equal access. So that understanding that some people come in with more privileges, and sometimes we have to give extra support so people can feel like they're on the same level. But we see that there is still a barrier that's there, even when we start to think about equity. What we really have to engage in is liberation. And that means that those systemic barriers are removed. Liberation requires us to think about the person and their environment. And that's why education about things like microaggressions and how to treat other people in an equitable way and affirm their identities is necessary. We know that these biases can affect other parts of our life. And if a person who is making a law holds racist or misogynistic beliefs, those laws won't be followed through correctly. Those laws won't be followed through in that way. So we have to remove those barriers. The reality is we don't always do that. We talk about liberation, but the reality is that there has to be some attitude adjustments change on a personal level before we get to that place, or as we move through that place. Sometimes people too talk about liberation in a way of thinking about personal liberation. And personal liberation is like this idea that self-development enables you to have a life of freedom. So they say things like, well, if you have these skills and tools about healthy relationships, or if you have this opportunities, that your life can be free. But is that really the case? We saw that happen with Ahmaud Arbery, who was a person who was just running. That's not always the case, that just because you do things to develop yourself, that you're free from things. So that's why this has to be a social liberation. Social liberation refers to the need to liberate people from social pressures, and particularly those that create and reproduce inequities due to economic, class, sex, race, and national origin. That's why, again, when I talked about these stereotypes that we hold and these biases that we hold, that is why it's so important, because we aren't able to fully give folks a life of freedom if we aren't coalescing and coming together as a community. Social liberation requires us to wake up and to realize where we fall short. It requires us to have dialogue with communities, and not in a way where we feel like we're saving people again, but in a way that we're actually understanding and learning what folks are already doing and giving them equal access in the conversation. It also takes maintaining and sustaining. That means always learning and always trying to be more aware. And again, by being here today, you're showing that you're a part of that. You're a part of this learning and growing and knowing. So I want to end with this, and I want to end with hope, because my other thought is too that this is the time we have to really engage young people in this movement as well. We can no longer just stand by as adults and make decisions. When you have your boards or you have your youth advisory boards, it does not need to only be made up of young white women, which is the truth for a lot of folks. It's time to strategize ways that you can get young Black people more involved in your organization so they feel that sense of belonging and your organization feels safe. I believe it's possible. I have faith that it's possible. I've seen changes since I've been doing this work. And I hope that we can engage in some conversations and strategize ways that can be possible for you. So thank you all. Follow me on the socials. Feel free to reach out. This is my contact information.
Thank you so much, Tanji. Thank you, thank you. I am clapping from here. I wish we could all be in the same room so that we could clap for you, applaud. Thank you so much. I know we have a lot of questions. Please feel free to add your questions into the chat. Again, this is a conversation, and Tanji has set this up for us, right? The intersectionality. For me, it's very simple that I cannot separate being Mexicana and a woman from being formerly undocumented, a caregiver, a daughter. I am all of these. I am a preventionist, and I hold all of these identities at the same time. the intersections of our work in a very similar way. The oppression that folks face work in a very similar way, as Tanji has shared. So we are going to continue this conversation about how these intersections show up in our work in the field of domestic violence and sexual violence. We are going to hear from a very dear colleague, advocate, activist for change. And then again, we will open up for an entire conversation. Colsaria Henderson has a master's in social work with a specification in administration and planning. She is from the South and considers her social justice training buried in the roots of activist parents who dedicated their early lives to the civil rights movement. She began working in the field in the 1990s and began her official career in anti-gender-based violence work as a sexual assault counselor in Atlanta, Georgia. She later finished a Bachelor's of Science in social work while working in a dual domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy agency. Since moving to California, she has held leadership roles in multiple Bay Area anti-violence organizations. Over the last many years, Colsaria has focused her work at the macro level, enjoying leadership and program development, survivor and community-based evaluation and advocacy, and statewide policy change. She is currently focused in the areas of intersection between gender-based violence movements and reproductive justice, racial justice, LGBTQ, and immigrant rights. Wow, talk about intersectionality. Colsaria has completed several leadership and advocacy programs, including the Women's Policy Institute through the Women's Foundation of California and the Strong Field Leadership Program sponsored by Blue Shield of California Foundation. She currently serves on the board of directors of the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence. Colsaria, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for leading this conversation. You are walking the talk. You understand what it means to be an executive director leading this work, the fears that come up for folks. Tell us a little bit about your experience.
Thank you. Good morning. I am so excited to be here. I'm honored, honestly, to be a part of this. And Tanji, I'm going to fly down to Southern California just so we can have coffee as soon as this COVID-19 is a little bit more under control. This is such an important conversation. And I just want to start by saying that anytime I start these conversations or I start to talk about essentially things that can often be difficult, it's important for me to ground myself in my values. And so for me, those values are equity, radical love, and collective liberation. And those are the three pieces that I really focus and intentionally try to be rooted in whenever we begin these conversations. I stand before you and want to be 100% honest. I come with a lot of privilege as an executive director. I'm a first-time executive director, and I came largely from the program side, from doing both prevention and intervention work. I will say that being an executive director was when I was working in the very beginnings of this work, when I was doing education on sexual violence prevention and working with Planned Parenthood, and when I was working in the shelter programs, being an executive director was never on my mind. And I think it has really been a trajectory that specifically has been about trying to ensure that that power and privilege is looked at, and that we are thinking through all of these intersections on a regular basis. So it comes from a place of not always being seen, and definitely not always being heard. And so I just want to acknowledge that I am also one of very few Black women that are executive directors of anti-violence organizations, particularly around domestic violence and sexual violence organizations in our state. And that we are a dying breed honestly. Many executive directors, not just Black executive directors, but executive directors of color have been pushed out of our field. And so I would like to sort of start with, you know, where my heart has been since in the last few weeks, which is really around the areas in which I believe we as a movement need to begin to call attention and call out the places of white supremacy that exist within our own field. I don't know if it's late enough in the day for people to engage in this conversation, but it is absolutely something that is constantly on my mind. And that's really that space when people ask, and they've been asking and asking over and over again, right, throughout our country, but what can I do? What can we do? I think that for the domestic violence and sexual violence fields, particularly, the first places, as the partnership, actually, the statement the partnership released recently discusses, is our ways in which we can hold a mirror to what we are, what we give into. And because of that, I 100% believe that our communities, survivors, families, individuals, all that will be better off if we deal with our own stuff. And so I'm sure you guys have a lot of ways. I'm really curious as the ways that people see it play out, and the ways that we, sometimes intentionally, honestly, and sometimes unintentionally, are a part of this, right? Are a part of these systems. And you know, one of the ways in which many of the organizations, and so I'm just going to name a few, and again, this is not an exhaustive list. I set out to create an exhaustive list, and I had pages and pages, honestly. And so I'm only going to name a few, but the ways in which I see it most often in this field, some of those things are while we have gotten better, and I don't want to, you know, again, we are constantly moving and changing, and that's exactly what we should be doing. So while we have gotten better, we still have often a very one-size-fits-all approach to this work, right? And we, you know, we think we don't, right? Because we have a menu of options at our organizations and where people come in. But just literally what is offered is often still a one-size-fits-all approach. And particularly for people of color, it is not something that they are going to be successful at. I challenge every organization that is listening and out there, including my own, to look at the success rate of people of color. And you can define success in whatever way that you want to, but the success rate of people of color in your programs. I have worked in organizations where Black people were much more often thrown out of shelters, where Black and brown folks were less likely to follow through, so to speak, on case management services. You know, what we need to think about these things, and they can be scary and they're hard, they're complicated, but I believe it is important for us to name them and begin then to start thinking and working in our communities about how to address them. It's not about our organizations. It's not up to us to have the answers. Our communities and working with people will have the answers. The same way that the domestic violence and sexual violence movement became super successful around doing a lot of the intervention and prevention work was because we listened, right, to community, right? We listened to people and began to work diligently based on their own experiences. It's similar work. It's similar work. Another way that I see white supremacy show up in our organizations is how we define leadership. We often define it in a very hierarchical form. So I say that sitting to you 100% as an executive director. But we also, the way in which we look at what leadership traits are is inherently biased. And we need to recognize that. And it's an interesting part of intersectionality, because often they're also sexist, even though we are a part of a system that is largely based on on, you know, on women and gender nonconforming and LGBT. Like we have been rooted and based, right? And honestly, and at the same time, it is largely white male attributes in which we look at for leadership and what leadership will be. And that comes across the board. So it's who gets promoted, right? It's who is, whose voice is at the forefront, who gets to represent the organization and how they represent the organization. It's also in our boards, right? And who were chosen. It's also in who we think of as a donor, as a worthwhile donor, right? We have work to do. Another way in which, you know, that, and sorry, in the leadership piece, you know, obviously that's representation, but it's also, again, I just really want to call attention and make sure that people understand that it's leadership attributes as well. The way in which we idealize specific attributes around who can talk a certain way, who can look a certain way, who can present a certain way, and what that expectation is. Sometimes that also comes out with a definition of leadership that means you already have an answer in which you are going to constantly be a decision maker. When many of, particularly people of color, we are rooted in a collective process. We are dependent upon a collective process, and that does take longer. I'm not going to argue with you. It does take longer, and it doesn't mean you can always do it. If there's a fire, I don't need a collective process to get everybody out of the building, right? That's not what we're talking about, but we're talking about the decisions that we make on a regular basis. We're talking about how we do our work. It's around pay equity. I'm just going to say it. It's around pay equity, right? Who we pay, what we value, and that leads to that pay. It is important for us as organizations to think. I would just challenge us to go outside of the nonprofit salary surveys, which are also inherently in a system that is rooted in systemic oppression work. So we need to think about what that really means, what a livable wage means, what is, and that includes our benefits. You know, that includes what we offer people and what that looks like, and how do we really connect. If we really want people who are a part of our communities, who as a representation, then we have work to do, and that means we need to have a culture and pay that equates to that. That goes into hiring. Obviously, we need to think about our hiring practices. You know, we need to challenge each other about them. Sometimes we don't even know that we're doing them, right? And I have definitely been guilty of that in the process. When we think about, when we do some very basic things are possible. You know, when we don't list how much a job pays on a job description, we do not give families, and particularly families of color or low-income folks, an opportunity to make decisions around whether or not they want to go for this job, and whether they want to take a leap or a step towards this work. When we, you know, traditionally we have had barriers that we have set, barriers that our organizations have set around hiring folks that have utilized our services at some point in time. It is really a time for us to hold up a mirror. If we really believe, as many people are beginning to, and we should definitely go back at 100 and address organizations that didn't feel comfortable aligning themselves with Black Lives Matter, or aligning themselves with addressing systemic racism in our country and in our communities. We should really go back to that. But for folks that are saying that's what they want to do, it's time for us to really think about ways to hold up that mirror. The other places, honestly, we used to just call it tokenism, and we often just don't do that. We don't call it out as that anymore. But we ask Black folks and brown folks, you know, and people of color to lead the conversations. We ask them and depend on them. We depend on them to bring the issues forward. So people who have the most to lose, the hardest and difficult path forward, we depend on them to be the one. I don't know what it was like for many of you in the last few weeks, but I would be curious about how many of you were asked, if you were brown or Black, or asked to lead the statement for the organization, right? Or asked, what should we do? Right. We really have to begin to address that, and it is. Well, there's lots to be said, so we should, if people want, we should come back to that. And I'm seeing some of the comments come up, and it is exhausting. Some folks are talking about how exhausting it is for people of color. It is exhausting from not just we also are doing all this other work, right? Place, but it is exhausting from an emotional burden place. You know, many of us have been in a situation where we are the only one in the room or the only one in the organization. And sometimes we're the only one in big county meetings and the only one at the, you know, it is already exhausting. And to be asked to teach someone else about it, to lead that cause. And often that lead, by lead, it's not even, it's not a partner with. It's like, we would like you to do all the work, type it out, tell us what you want to do, put it in front of us on a desk, and then we'll make a determination if we're going to do any of it, right? I really want people to walk away and understand that there are inherent safety issues with this for Black and brown folks, and 100% truthful, which I promised myself it would be today. Is there, while I sit in a position of definitely of authority as an executive director of an amazing organization, $6 million organization that does amazing work and is the only one in the county, while I sit in that position, and so I sit in privilege, there are safety issues that are constantly, that run through my head when we talk about race. I realize we are in an anti-violence movement, so when we talk about safety, we need to be very careful. And I'm normally someone who is trying to pull apart safety and comfort, but I want to call out that I am talking about safety, not comfort. There are definitely uncomfortable things that also occur, but I'm talking about safety, that people have been pushed out of jobs, not given, you know, silenced. There are a lot there in our movement. I know it's shocking to think about us as a social justice movement, that's what we would do, but they have been for speaking and talking about these things. And so it is always a risk. And the last piece that I want to name right now, for the sake of time and wanting to make sure that people are, we answer questions and keep this conversation going, and is the big way in which is directly tied to what we've seen in the last couple of weeks. And honestly, this is what we've seen on camera in the last couple of weeks. But honestly, this has been my life and my parents' life and my grandparents' life. And I'm from the South. And it's very much a part of our my upbringing, all of my life. So the killing and murdering of Black and brown people from at the hands of law enforcement has been a part of a conversation in my world since I was 3 years old. and my dad got pulled over for the first time. For the first time with me in the car. It's been a part of the conversation. Personally, I have 3 children, 2 Black boys, and my oldest boy is 8. And he's been constantly practicing raising his hands really slowly in the mirror in the last 2 weeks. And naming what it looks like, what he needs to say, clarifying to an officer that he is only 8 years old and that he has nothing that will harm them. This is a daily occurrence and a daily part of our lives. And so when we do in this movement, when we are inherently dependent on law enforcement response, it is a real difficulty and it's a real barrier to people of color to utilize and trust us. It doesn't, you know, it is, and I want to call out that we're obviously talking about law enforcement, but there are a lot of systems. We work, you know, particularly in nonprofits, there are a lot of systems that are involved with this. Court systems, in which Black and brown people don't office water for a lot of reasons, for immigration reasons, because particularly right now, but also because the systems have not been fair. There is no fair and justice that have occurred in those systems. And so we grow up knowing that we already come at a disadvantage in those systems. And so for us to trust those systems, or for us as advocates of all kinds to sit across on a crisis line or across from someone and try to persuade someone that these systems are safe and will be okay for them. That for me has been the most inherent piece. When, you know, the National Hotline did a survey, over 75% of those responses came back and said that they were worse off for calling law enforcement, for law enforcement's involvement. Survivors. I'm not saying that law enforcement have not helped survivors or aren't a part of our process in our country. I am calling attention to the fact that us as a movement, we cannot just have a law enforcement or court-related system approach and expect people of color to just trust it and to move through it. And we need to figure out and have these conversations. And it's different in every single community, what that looks like, right? It's different. Some of you are probably sitting in a family justice center, right? Or your agency has folks in a family justice center. Some of you, probably many of you, have someone that works literally and sits in a law enforcement office, right, on a regular basis. This has been a long-standing part of this movement and this work, but I want to call out is that we have forgotten that there have been other movements and other works, also anti-violence, that have specifically worked on alternatives to this. And it is important that we think about our organizations, our voices, lifting up those alternatives. Because truly what we all want is for communities to be safe and to thrive. That is what we all want, and that I 100% believe. And so we cannot have, again, a one-way approach to doing this work. All right, I'm going to be quiet. Thank you so much for giving me a little bit of a soapbox.
No, it's not a soapbox. It's the reality. Your reality and the reality of so many people of color, so many Black folks across our organizations. Thank you so much. The chat is full of yes, yes, thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you, Kolsaria.
Yes, thank
Tanji?
you. I just, and thank you. Thank you for saying that and for expressing that, because what you're saying, I know resonated deeply with me. I felt everything you said. And I know that that is experienced for many Black folks in this movement and other people of color in this movement. I especially like that you said that, like, people are not staying and sticking around. That for me that hurts deeply, like on a personal level, because there are so many other Black women that I know that gave valuable work to this movement only to be pushed out of their organizations. And this movement cannot thrive and exist without Black women. And it's starting to feel uncomfortable for a lot of folks. It's starting to feel, like you said, unsafe. And we can't even begin to touch the surface of anything if people don't even feel like they want to. The people who identify with the groups we want to support don't even feel comfortable working in the movement. So thank you for raising all that up, because you said nothing but the absolute truth. There was
Thank you.
a question that someone asked me too privately about how you can promote agency without saving. As a white person, I wanted to talk about that, and that's why we can't look at our roles as preventionists or as advocates as saving in the first place. I think that's the first thing is feeling like you have to save someone, and without looking at them as a person who is able to make choices and decisions that are safest for them. So that means you have to have dialogue. So personal agency doesn't have to sound like this is what you need to do. It can sound empowering to someone. I like to share a story where I first learned about personal agency from my grandma. And I was 18 and it wasn't anything to do with sexual violence or relationship abuse. She was talking about a tattoo. And I wanted to get a tattoo, and my mom said, you need to ask your grandma, because she's like, was really religious, and my mom thought she would tell me no, but she did. She said she didn't want me to, and she told me to read the Bible, but she also said, but it's your body, and you make that choice about what you want to do with your body. That for me was what personal agency is. And I carried that even working with young people too. I remember working with a student who wanted to wear high heels, and my colleagues, she was a young Black girl, my colleagues would say things like, oh, they actually were saying she's going to get raped. She's walking down the street with high heels on. And I had to correct them. But then even talking to her, talking about high heels hurt when you have to walk on concrete, and just having that conversation about how she felt about being judged in that way. So it doesn't have to come from a place of safety. It just has to come from a place of honesty and vulnerability. Letting people know, like, your body is yours, and everybody should offer it respect, that you have a right to say and do this. So take that away. And I'm going to drop some links for some resources I think will be helpful. First is a video that goes along with the Georgetown study that I mentioned about adultification of Black girls. I'm also going to drop a link for Push Out. It's streaming free on PBS right now. It's about Black girls being pushed out of school. And also, there's an organization in Detroit called Sasha Center, founded by Kalima Johnson, and she created a model called Black Women's Triangulation of Rape. And so it talks about power and privilege and how receiving services is inequitable for Black women, and how even as an organization that supports Black women, she has had struggles and barriers with things like funding and things like the validity of her programming, because she does holistic healing and goes beyond what we view as advocacy. So I'm going to pop those in the chat and share it. I encourage you all to take a look at them.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. I know there are a lot of questions, and I do want to come back to a couple of them. So first, going back, I think to Kulsaria, you were speaking about tokenism, and this touched a lot of us, right? We are asked to bring the issues forward, and many folks have shared either personally with me on the chat or with everyone that there are folks of color who have been invited to write these statements for their organizations. I have been someone who has been asked, in the past in other organizations to speak up until you mention something with which the leadership does not agree with, right? So folks have shared that there are organizations that have been okay with the entire statement that you wrote up, except that piece on law enforcement, or that piece on, you know, the killing of Black lives at the hand of law enforcement, because domestic violence organizations and rape crisis centers work so closely with law enforcement. It's a relationship we don't want to hurt. What are your thoughts to that? How do we address that? When you speak of alternatives, how can we hold ourselves accountable and our organizations accountable?
So I think there are a lot of places to start, and I think each organization's relationship to law enforcement is a little differently. For example, in some of the organizations that I have worked with, there are many organizations in the county, right, that are all that do some similar work. So you have multiple domestic violence or sexual violence organizations, and you know, again, I'm in the Bay Area, so the counties can be quite vast and a lot of organizations in them often. And in that space, you know, I think having an honest conversation with your other organizations around, what does this look like? How are we, say 5 of us or whoever it is, how are we all ensuring that there are alternatives to just the law enforcement system, right? Amongst us, right? It may not be everyone in that county. Then there are other places, like for us, for at Cora, we are the only organization that is focused in this area. And I say this saying that we have many law enforcement relationships because of that. And I think that what I would recommend is that if there is a way to get leadership to understand, in the same way that we think about our toolbox. I mean, how many of us weren't really thinking, well, you guys are probably younger than I am, but how many of us 15 and 20 years ago doing this work weren't thinking that we needed to be housing experts, or weren't thinking that we needed to be immigration or homeless or experts, or working with our COCs, or that we needed to know about mental health and outside of the trauma specifically of violence, right? It's about expanding your toolbox. If you look at your community and say, okay, you know, we have some of our community that's going to call law enforcement, that feels perfectly safe doing so, that acknowledges the response. What are the options that we have for folks that aren't or don't? Are we talking to survivors and our community members about how safe they feel? And I think if there's a way to really talk about it being another part of our toolbox, right? It's, you know, it's really that we cannot have this one-way approach to how this work happens. And it's, you know, and people they understand, at least logically. I'm not saying we're doing it all really well all the time, but they understand logically why we can't say we have a support group and not have a place for the children to go. Right? They understand that, like, you know, yes, there's a survivor of intimate partner violence or sexual violence, right? But they're also a mother, or also a father, or also a grandma, whatever it is. Like, they understand that we exist, you know, again, in under multiple identities, but then we should have multiple layers of approaches that understand for the community, right? That work for communities. And the other piece that I think often happens is we sit back on our heels around the last 40 years. We stop with, well, that's worked. It's worked forever to do things this way. You know, so we know it's working, so we're just going to work. But it's been working for less and less percentage of the population. And at the same time, it was working so well because we weren't thinking about these other people. They weren't even in our, right? Like, and I get it, right? Capacity is capacity is a constant problem, right? For all of us. It's nonprofit work. And we are activists. We are super busy, but it is so important when we think about communities, to ask communities, to talk to communities about what will work for them, and for us not to paint the box, right? It's not about us saying, between these three things, right? It's not a Survey Monkey. Here are the three options. Which of these three options will work best for you? It's really a place that we have to start thinking and listening and paying attention. You know, we use our data for funders, but imagine what if we could use it to actually improve the lives of the communities around us.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm hearing from folks also about the barriers that exist, right? I've been in places where your Family Justice Center, right, is housed within law enforcement, and you're wanting survivors of color to show up when that entity, that building, does not feel safe for you. Why would you access that service? And there are folks who are also saying that you are asked as an advocate to meet with law enforcement to provide services to a survivor when law enforcement is not safe for you either. So it has brought up a lot of challenges recently and in these last several months. And for a lot of folks, as you mentioned, Kulsaria, this is not new. Mm-hmm. So there are folks who are very interested in having a conversation, an ongoing conversation about how do we rethink our work with police department. And then there are others who, as was shared last week in the conversation with preventionists, how do we work with a system that was created to oppress people? Mm-hmm. We were speaking about how, if you look up at the development of law enforcement was set up, policing was set up to keep slaves in their place. Mm-hmm. So at the foundation of this system, there's harm. Mm-hmm. How do we change that? And folks were talking about child welfare and a couple of these systems that we have to call when situations are coming up. These are all systems that were created with a foundation of harm. How do we move past that? Mm-hmm.
I think that we really have to not be afraid to challenge them. I think because something like if a government sets it up or any kind of authority sets it up, we have this idea that authority means right, or authority means what we should do. And we have to question that all the time. For me, that means that if you do trainings with law enforcement, always insert issues about racial justice and oppression. Always be willing to teach, because as an advocate or as someone who is aware of racial justice and privilege, you have a responsibility. So always include it and don't be afraid to include it. And I think also too, remembering that that dialogue is important, and be willing to be flexible and creative with how you get support and give support. Listen to the people that are already doing things in a way that challenges some of the beliefs that we've had before. So I think that's where it starts, for sure. Always in any kind of training you do, any kind of conversation, make sure that is at the forefront, and that becomes a standard and not something you just put in when you're only working with the Black community, or only working with Latinx community, or only working with trans community. It needs to be a constant conversation.
So speaking of conversations, I wanted to bring in a couple of other folks into this conversation. Holly Grace Curry is a Youth and Prevention Services Manager at Havens Women's Center. Rebecca Melendez, I hope you're still on here, also a Program Director at East LA Women's Center. And I would like to invite you all to join in our conversation, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself, so that I can ask some questions. We speak of empowerment, and I've worked in places where, folks say, well, Alejandra, I want to empower you to speak up and share of your challenges, right? And then I do, And I get told, but that doesn't happen here, right? Are you sure? Are you hearing this from people? Do you have statements that maybe folks have mentioned about this racism showing up in our organization? Because that doesn't happen here. So I love that Kolsaria was talking about, you know, and Tanji of disempowerment, of we want to empower you. So does that mean that my empowerment is dependent upon you? No, that's pretty effed up. Like, no, I empower myself. And does that mean that my liberation then depends on you? It just, there are contradictory statements in this conversation. Empowerment does start to feel about this control, these dynamics that show up in our organizations. And we've been talking about folks that have been pushed out. And if we were to bring them into this conversation, and several folks are here, it has been because they have brought these challenges to the forefront. They have brought up the barriers that exist for people of color, the survivors of color, the staff of color. And when it doesn't agree with where the leadership want to go or where they are or their comfort, they're questioned. Are you sure? Did that really happen? And even folks we're hearing right now in the statements that the partnership sent out yesterday about introspection, right? And thinking about us and holding ourselves accountable. We've heard from staff that are saying, but we've gone to leadership. We've gone to the board of directors and things aren't changing. So then what do staff do? They leave. And for me, as a woman of color who has had to leave, it wasn't the first choice. Mm-hmm. I was pushed out for being the one who ruffled feathers, the one who questioned the board of directors, the one who asked, why are we not training the board of directors on prevention, on intervention, on oppression and cultural considerations? Well, that's not their role. So as was mentioned last week by prevention staff, and today it's brought up again, where are your values? What are those values? And as someone reminded us, please make sure that it's not just a poster that hangs on in your lobby. It has to be action oriented. So Holly Grace, Rebecca, and other leadership staff at organizations, how have you, I know Holly Grace, May mentioned, May, the executive director at Haven, mentioned that, and she did say this quote, so I will share that at the very beginning there was fear, right, for the changes that May was putting forward at Haven. There was fear of losing funders, there was fear of losing donors, of losing board of directors, and they did lose donors. They did lose board of directors members. However, the one item that we most often don't talk about is the gain of new board members, the gain of new donors that are committed to your culturally responsive programs, that are committed to your intersectionality. And as May said, that's been a tough road. So Holly Grace, what are your thoughts? How have you as a manager, as a supervisor, as a white leader at an organization, how have you held yourself accountable? And what are some recommendations that you have for others?
Thank you so much for just inviting my opinion at all. And I know May really wanted to participate in this herself. And as most executive directors are, cutting checks and processing AP and working from home and just trying to juggle it all. She just couldn't be with us today. I was not part of the founding of our agency's work with Next Generation, but we've done a lot of cultural responsiveness work that started, prior to my being involved in that. And something that we've been doing for the last few years is implicit bias training, courageous conversations. So it's now mandatory following our 73-hour sexual assault and domestic violence training, but all staff and volunteers must also go through, I think it's 8 hours of courageous conversations training, where we're really breaking down implicit bias and its impact on the survivors that we serve every day. It impacts how we respond to colleagues in the workplace. So that's something that we've been really committed to, and I highly recommend having staff take the Harvard implicit bias test to see just how that shows up in your life, in your work. It's humbling to do. Our next generation, we have sort of a subcommittee, a little task force at Haven. And I think the idea with that group is that we can be a sounding board for staff concerns, for board concerns, for things we're hearing in the community, so that we're really keeping cultural competence and humility at the forefront of what we do. We have a lot more to do. We have more to learn. We're not perfect at what we're doing. Like self-care, some of this work falls by the wayside when you're trying to get a grant report in, or it's whatever, the busy time. It's always a busy time. So we are here to remind each other and ourselves that this is really critical work to be doing, to not let it be on the back burner, to not let it be somebody else's job. We've gotten a lot more public on social media as well. And I think May is right that in taking a firm stance around like LGBT inclusion, when we had a straight pride rally that was going to be happening in our town. And I think some board and community members may not have quite understood why we took such a stance as an agency and saying like, hey, we stand behind LGBTQ lives and we don't stand for hate in our community in any form. So again, prioritizing intersectional analysis of issues. It was mentioned earlier, the connections between gun violence and domestic violence and sexual assault, that we are trying to speak up where we can. And the truth is, we live in a really conservative county. We always say we're a red county in a blue state. And when it feels unsafe as an agency to make a strong statement, we will often post the partnership statement. And we appreciate you being that sounding board for saying, hey, this is our statement around Black Lives Matter or school shootings or whatever the hot issue is that may be off-putting to some members of our community. We really appreciate being able to repost and elevate the words of our statewide coalition leaders, and almost using that as a buffer sometimes to make the statement and still feel like we're not jeopardizing critical community relationships and partnerships that we can't do without.
Yeah, thank you. And a question we have is, why would you want those donors and board members if they don't align with your values?
Right. And when you make space for someone to depart who's not feeling like they're in alignment with our values, it definitely opens up an opportunity for someone else who is aligned.
Yeah, thank you. Rebecca.
Hello.
Rebecca, LA, my
here.
dear, you have been involved in protests and riots since forever.
Yeah.
I know Los Angeles is a very different world than, as Haven was just sharing, as Holly Grace was just sharing in Haven. Tell us about your work. How do you hold the organization accountable? You work very closely with the executive director. You are a very assertive woman of color. And we have heard about you and the way in which you support the personal agency and affirmation, identity affirmation of staff, right? Supporting staff and showing up with their full selves. Tell us a little bit of that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca. I'm with the East Los Angeles Women's Center. I'm a program director. I think first I need to clarify that I too sit from a position of privilege. We're an organization that's 99% made up of women of color. So when I speak, I know that there isn't going to be the same level of consequence that perhaps is going to come from some of my sisters who are not made up of the same demographics. And so I always say that with confidence because I know that my voice is not going to be silenced, it's going to be backed, and then I can go to my executive director and actually run some of the the things that I know are about to come out of my mouth. I can run them by her, and she rewords them or reshapes them or encourages them or, you know, whatever it takes. But I have that ability. And so I just want to be clear that, that I do have a privilege that is not afforded to many of my sisters who work in organizations that look different than mine. I appreciate the both of you stepping forward with so much honesty and sincerity. I acknowledge that it's not a easy place to be this open because you guys were very transparent. In case anybody here is wondering, these are not conversations that we have in public, right? These are conversations that we have amongst our sisterhood. But to that, anybody who is taking notes, I wanna just affirm to you that this is not a trending topic for us. This is our lives. This is what we live every day. So this isn't a hashtag, this isn't a moment, this is generations and generations and generations of our lives that has constantly been, we wake up in the morning and we don't get to choose, you know, what outfit we're gonna put on to celebrate that holiday. We live it every single day. So for me, I always kid around and say that I got really lucky. I started off in an organization that was ran in the 90s by a woman of color who was a Republican. And so you can imagine that was Pete Wilson's California. And I knew that this was the work that I wanted to do. I knew that I wasn't being supported by my executive director because I was I mean, this is always who I've been no matter what. Thank you, Mom and Dad, but this is always who I've been, right? And for me, instead of being pushed out, I sought out those around me who could guide me, who could provide me, who could help me lift my voice. I am a disciple of Alba Moreno and Sharon Shelton. I say that with a lot of pride because they really shaped how I approach a system. And so I feel the obligation to always, when I'm in spaces, I can see the struggle and I know what that face looks like when there's somebody in the room who wants to speak up and doesn't because of fear, simply because of fear. So I always make it a point and let them know, okay, what's going on? I'm here. How can I mentor you, right? Or how can I work with you? Or do you have any questions or what do you need? And unfortunately, over the last many years, a lot of those people have been pushed out. And so we start all over again, because they have no support. So to anybody who's on this call, who's a woman of color and doesn't feel like they're being heard in their organizations, I would say to you, seek out your leadership. And to those women who are not women of color, I would say to you, allow that mentorship to happen. It is not a threat to you or how you're going to run your organization. They're not planning a coup. We don't talk about how to take over organizations. It literally is an opportunity for us to be able to coexist in a world that we have very little voice in. And so if you see these backdoor conversations happening, the first thing I would say to you is don't be threatened by them. If you have somebody like me speaking with your staff, encourage that, because while we may not live in the same worlds, we are allies in this work. I think the one thing that I want to also call out is my own community. We have a really large problem of interhorizontal racism that happens in our communities. And anybody who is on this call that has worked with me for the last 20 years can tell you that I have been trying to kickstart the conversation internally with my sisters for a number of years, right? But what happens? Everybody has accountability to our organizations, and while everybody starts to move forward, we all don't sit down and say, okay, how do we move this conversation forward? And so I think that while I recognize that everybody keeps focusing on the Black community, I want to remind my community that this is not their struggle alone. That we have an obligation at this point, right? To speak up and to make it clear, and to and not make our sisters feel once again like they have to carry the burden while we coast through the hashtags. I think the last point I want to say is we talk a lot about challenging people. I strongly believe that it is not the smartest way, and I'm talking to women of color and non-women of color. It is not the smartest way to challenge another human being, because automatically you're going to be met with defense. You educate a human being on your perspective. We challenge systems. It is a very different approach. If we want to walk hand in hand, if we want to move forward, you need to look at the person in front of you, humanize them, get to know them, educate yourself on who they are, what their true intentions are, what their history is, learn our history, right? And I'll learn your, well, I've had to learn yours for the last, 45 years of my life. Learn our history, and together we can challenge this system. I'm here for anybody who wants to further this conversation. Alejandra, I want to thank you for putting together this platform. It's not a popular topic to have. It pains me that we're having to go through these growing pains, but I think that we as a movement have a place in this conversation, and I appreciate all of you guys for showing up, because that is symbolic as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. Rebecca and I have had conversations. I know that the comment she mentioned about our people, like the Latinos. I'm Mexicana again. That is my experience, formerly undocumented, and we have had conversations about what collective liberation means, and we need to engage in these conversations within our own community, because I have seen it on Univision and Telemundo, the way they are speaking up about those people, right? The riots of those people. What was George doing? Why was he detained? We have a wonderful relationship with Univision in Sacramento, and I have reached out. We are engaging in a conversation about the damage, the harm that causes to all of us when we speak that way. And we started talking about, what does it mean? What does collective liberation mean? And how difficult it is at times, because we feel unheard. So if you are looking at the news, or you are reading something in the newspaper, if you're reading that, or online, and it says Black people, the way oppression works is, if you don't see yourself there, then you think it's not about you. It's those people. Collective liberation is about all of us, recognizing that when we stand with Black folks, we are standing up for all of us. And that is a hard concept to understand when you have felt isolated, shut down, questioned, silenced. We need to speak up to our own communities, because I love that where, Jackie, who's on here, says, power only recognizes power that is equal or greater to itself. And white folks need to talk to white folks. Black folks have been having this conversation forever. The experience that Latinos, Hispanos have in this country is also one of racism. And we have to have conversations amongst ourselves and with each other. So as we shared at the beginning, this is not the first or the last. We are going to continue the conversation, because we speak about the difference between freedom and liberation. Freedom has a stop. Liberation is ongoing. Liberation requires action from all of us, not just a hashtag, not a black box that you post on social media on Blackout Tuesday. It requires that you ask yourself, what am I doing to stand up for Black lives? What am I doing to participate in racial justice within our organization, within our work? And going back to the accountability of our organizations, I just wanted to share something with you all and then open it up for questions. So please get ready with your questions so that you can type them in or unmute yourself so that we can have an open dialogue. Ella Baker, radical activist, and I love the term radical, right? She speaks about this framework for collective liberation and says, in order for us as poor and oppressed people to become part of a society that is meaningful, the system under which we now exist has to be radically changed. It means facing a system that does not lend itself to your needs and devising means by which you change that system. So what changes do we need to engage in within the DV and SV field? We are inviting everyone to this introspection, to hold ourselves accountable in your role, in your work, with your identities, your intersectionality. What does radical change look like? What do we need from our executive directors? What do we need from our board of directors? What do we need from our supervisors and leadership staff? What do we need for radical change to take place within our field? Because we have caused harm. We have hurt survivors. We have hurt staff. That has to stop. What do we need to create radical change within our field? Thank you for the comments in the chat. I love. We need them to be not afraid to speak out. We need to not be afraid to speak out. Education and these types of conversations are a great start, but we need more for sure. Absolutely. We can start by saying the word Black and police brutality. We need more people willing to be transparent. We need to understand and address intersectional factors. Take accountability to solve these issues. Create a safe space for folks to feel safe, using the right words and calling it out. Leadership, open and receptive to feedback and insight. Yes, acknowledging that we do, moving past the one size fits all. We need to do fundraising differently. Understand that there is privilege. Upstander intervention with organizations. Listen to people of color. Intentional conversations where people don't fear being fired if they speak up with controversial perspectives. Yes, racism, a disease of white people. How do we engage white folks in this conversation? Moving these tasks to the forefront, not just as back burners or things you do to meet grant deadlines or that cultural competency training that you do every time you do your 40-hour or 65-hour training. Train the board. How many of you have trained board members on cultural responsiveness, intersectionality of oppression, privilege, and violence? How's that gone? Making implicit bias trainings available for all. Yes. We need to stop saying that having an all-white staff is okay because we are diverse in other ways. Hold law enforcement friends and colleagues accountable for their harmful actions and ideals. Yes. What about recruiting board members that can show that they are engaged in and committed to racial justice? Yeah. When you hear from folks that say that's not how it's always been done, you know what I love to say? Then change it. Like, why do we have to stay stuck to that's how it's always been done? No. And I have spoken up with speaking of equity, and please let's unmute so we can have a conversation. When we speak about equity, I am a bilingual educator, and in every single job I have held the role of a bilingual staff member, which means I need to translate, I need to interpret. And how often are we paid for that additional skill? Oh wait, I got a 2% increase because I'm bilingual. That is not 2% more of my work. And we have so many advocates that are bilingual that are required to carry the same caseload as their non-bilingual counterparts, and maybe they're paid an extra 2%. That is not equity. But we go and we present to conferences on economic justice in the DV field. So again, a reminder, an invitation to all of us, and it sucks, and it feels uncomfortable to put that mirror up and look at ourselves and say, yeah, we're not paying bilingual staff for their bilingual work. Yeah, we're not promoting Black folks. Yes, we are not opening up those leadership trainings to people of color. We need to start looking at ourselves of what we are doing and not doing. And going back to those values that Kolsaria mentioned, of what are your values and how are you holding yourself accountable to that? And as we heard from Beth Ritchie at one of our Shifting the Lens conversation, when we say we want to end violence, ask yourself if that is really what you want to do, or if you want to be the best domestic violence organization or the best rape crisis center. Because if that is what you want to do, then change your mission statement. If you want to focus on ending violence, then you've got to commit to the intersectionality of ending violence. And that is why we are here, because that is what this is about. Accountability, intersectionality, and these tough conversations that hurt and are hurting. Annie says, why do I feel like this is the first time we are really having this conversation?
I think to an extent because it's a conversation that a lot of times is held after 5 in covert spaces, because there's that fear of what if leadership hears me, what if the white folks in the room hear me, and having to process their safety or whatever instead of being open to hearing that.
Thank you, Miranda. Who wants to unmute?
I'll unmute myself. My name is Cheyenne. I guess I mean, I have a question, looking for some advice, but for those of us who are in county-based programs, right, violence or prevention or domestic violence, we work in a system, right, that is government. Forget about training board members. We can't even reach out and send them an email because we're not allowed to, or we'll get in trouble. And so it feels, you know, I feel trapped in not being able to get to the people who can make the change, or who we really need to make the change and implement the change that needs to happen. And, you know, it's being stopped at, you know, just a level above me. It's not like, oh, I get 5 levels above and they say, no, you can't talk to the board and chosen freeholders. No, it stops. I get stopped right away. And that feels just, yeah, it makes me feel stuck. And I am obviously one of, you know, in county government, we know that no matter what county we're in New Jersey, it's going to be majority white. And so I'm one of few, you know, Black people in my local agency, but obviously probably in the bigger scale of the county. And so when we talk about, you know, voices not being heard and being shut down, it's, yeah, if we can't get an email to someone who matters, then how do we even, where do we start? And so I'm looking for anybody who, you know, has taken on feeling silenced at such a low level, obviously because we're being silenced at such a high level.
So I would just like to say, I think the first thing is, I think you got to find your allies. And I don't actually mean allies in this way. I mean, you need to go find other Black people. And you need a community of people that can, one, support you emotionally through this process, but also that can pull some ideas that are very locally based around that. And when you're looking for people, it might be somewhere else within the county. It might be, you know, it might be in other positions in the county, so it might not even be in your particular area, right? But it also could be, look at your local foundations. Look at, so, you know, are people in your local foundations that you can just have coffee with that are Black? Are there people that, you know, you need, you know, I have found experience. So I have been, and for, I don't even know, 10 years of, or 12 years of my career, the only Black person in the organization, right? And it has, while it's not the same, I've recognized the benefits of finding community, right? And a different kind of community, and finding colleagues that you can actually sit down with. One, that's where I think probably a lot of the great ideas will come from, but also just my heart goes out to, like, the emotional baggage that you carry, and that weight, and that feeling that is constantly pushed on us around hopelessness, or that we just won't be able to move anything forward. And, you know, the other benefit is that if you can't find it where you are, we're now all on Zoom. So I will put my email up here and let me know. And there are a group of Black women in this work, in domestic violence, sexual violence work. And every now and then we just get together because we just need to talk about it. And we're at all different levels, but it's, you know, so if you can't find it where you are, you know, there's nothing stopping us from making community right here.
I would love to echo that. Absolutely. I feel the exact same way. I know that I've maintained being stable and feeling like I can continue to do this work because of support from other Black women. And like you said, there are spaces. I sent you a message. I create sacred space for Black advocates in this movement because we have to be sustained and no longer pushed out or not belong. And that also goes especially for survivor grassroots organizations. there are too many grassroots organizations that don't get support because people don't see them as being valid because they don't have funding behind them or grant funding behind them from the government. And so a lot of times those survivor brand organizations end up staying at a local level or not getting kind of support that they need because of that. And so I really feel like the movement as a whole needs to do a better job with lifting up the voices of survivors that are trying to be a part of the movement and feel like they have that belonging too, because sometimes we use survivors, and I say sometimes very generously, we use survivors just as mouthpieces and as for dollars or just for stories, and that's it, and not see their true value in being a part of this movement. So thank you again, Kasari, for saying that, because yes, and I also like to, say Women of Color Network is around and there and is available for women of color too, but it shouldn't always feel like just an outside thing. And it should be okay, like Rebecca said, for people to be able to seek out that support too and not feel like it's a threat just because somebody is getting support and mentorship.
Absolutely. I want to highlight, bring up some of the comments that have been made in the chat about this as well. Very true. As a prevention specialist elsewhere, I did not have access to the full grant. And we've heard from preventionists that do not have access to reading the entire grant of what is expected, their deliverables. Most often, in some cases, from what we're hearing, prevention staff, you are being given, this is what you have to do, but you don't understand the entire purpose. So then you show up to a prevention training looking at logic models and looking at, right from the beginning to end, what is your purpose, what is your goal? And a lot of times advocates and preventionists are not equipped with the tools to have these conversations because of the gatekeeping that exists, because of holding back the information from folks. Why? What is the fear? I would love to understand that. What is a fear? It's important that we have these conversations because, yes, there are a lot of times that we have more control over what we can do with our funding, but it requires empowered staff to be able to ask questions. I am a rule breaker, so I am saying this because this is me. I was once told that I could not purchase, and I know that there's staff on here that are going to look at me like, why the H are you saying that? I have been told that I could not purchase food or giveaways, right, for the prevention work that we were doing to reach Hispanic and Latino parents. But we were required to do a 4-hour training. Now, I'm sorry, you do not bring, in my culture, you do not bring Mexicanos, Latinos into a 4-hour training, parents, and not offer childcare, not offer food, not offer giveaways, right, to be able to finish the conversation. And I love that I was told, you do not reach out to Cal OES. That is not your job. Your job is to follow your deliverables. Well, there was a program officer there that I had a name for at Cal OES, and this was years ago. They're no longer there. And I called and asked, right, these are some things that I need to have. What can I do? And I love that the person told me, get to know the handbook. Make the handbook your best friend. If you can find a way to make it work, and guess what? We now call them behavior modification materials because they are items that help support the modification of behavior from folks that are participating in your trainings. They complete the 4 hours, they get their handbag or they get their water bottle while they're participating in your training, and the food is a required product in order for folks to sit there through 4 hours. The childcare we were not able to do, but the school provided the childcare for the parents. You are able to find a way, but if we are constantly told that's not the way it's been done, you can't contact so-and-so, then we're always going to be told, we're always going to have that mindset. Yeah, your organizational budget is a reflection of your values. Yes, We need to challenge our systems. How do we do that? Let's engage with each other in these conversations. Rebecca.
So in the early 2000s, I was part of the South Region Women of Color group. Some of you may remember those days. And we challenged the fact that many of us who were bilingual and had to stay back to answer the hotline, because you always needed somebody who was bilingual on the hotline, right? Or those of us that were line staff that always needed to be out in the field, were always left out of the trainings and were always left out of the conferences. So those trainings and conferences were often reserved for people who were in leadership roles or who didn't have to be out in the field. So it was a lot of the same for a lot of people. So what we did, and I know that we have some folks from Cal CASA here, I don't know if it's still, I'm sure it's still policy. If it isn't, then we need to work to get it back. But so what we did was we asked Cal CASA that any funds that were going to be spent by the organizations on conferences or on trainings, one of those two people had to be people of color, right? And it wasn't because we wanted to go away for a week. It was because we needed access to the knowledge. We needed access to the information. We needed access to the education so that we can go back and then train our communities once again. We needed access to the networking. And so it is really imperative that we we were able to funnel all of the information to everybody across the organization equally, not just those who don't have to be out in the field or don't have to sit back to answer the hotline. I do want to address, there was a comment in the chat box that that maybe there was some generalization of populations on my behalf. I'll say this, if this doesn't apply to you, then you're good and we will walk together, right? If it does apply to you, then there is some work that we need to do to keep this conversation growing. And I'm gonna call you out, Alejandra and Jackie. I know that you're on this call. We do need to continue these conversations. We need to continue to really have these conversations across the spectrum, not once a year, not more regularly, because it's a service to all of us. So yeah, that's it.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is not one and done. We are continuing the conversation. We are committed to this. Yes, this is the first of many. This is also within the Prevention Peer Network webinars, which Miranda has been hosting for many years, and they are available every month. Because of COVID-19, and Prevention is asked for ongoing conversations that are responding to the needs of the community, we moved to every other Thursday. We have conversations about prevention and adaptations every other Thursday, so you are always welcome to join these. This is one where we received interest from folks beyond prevention, and I would love to ask, why not all? Why can't we all engage in conversations around prevention? If our goal is to end the violence, wouldn't you also have advocates and crisis intervention staff trained on prevention? Thank you. We did hear from prevention staff last week about creating a safe space. And as you know, Kosaria mentioned, that is not for me to determine what is safe. Everyone determines that for themselves, which is why we make the conversation at the very beginning of, you can change your name, you can turn off your video. It is not always safe. Folks are pushed out of their jobs. Folks are being pushed out of their jobs right now. It is not safe for everyone to speak up, which is why it requires that the rest of us that are able to speak up. White folks, how are you holding yourselves and other white folks accountable? Are you engaging in conversations of this, of racial justice, of intersectionality, of oppression and privilege over happy hour? Are you talking about them at dinner? Are you talking about them when you get together in leadership conversations? we should not be having this conversation only when the title of the webinar says intersectionality or racial justice or oppression. How do we hold ourselves accountable? Kosaria, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think that there, honestly, I just want to say, one, I'm going to start with saying thank you. The partnership has done so much work in the last few years to create spaces and to intentionally ask the hard questions. And I think that we're constantly feeling, or at least as a woman of color, I'm constantly feeling like, oh, almost, but not enough, right? You know, we get together, we have the conversation, and then how do we hold them, you know, the accountability to come back? Did we do what we said we were going to do? Did we react? Did we change something and shift something? Are we still working towards that amongst all of the work that we are constantly doing day in and day out? And I think that if we can create spaces for accountability circles within, then I think that are both uplifting and accountability, right? Accountability is not just did you make this something happen, right? But then I think that we will achieve some of these things together as a movement. I was struck by also one of the comments in the group chat around, you know, us as women of color. Like we can hold each other back. You know, we absolutely have some built-in systems, right, as well that don't necessarily challenge pieces that keep oppression going. And so how do we intentionally create spaces and conversations where people can finally call that into light and talk about it? And I think that that's been a difficult piece for many of us amongst everything else. And I know it's a hard thing to do in a diverse group. And so I think just as we've seen an influx of, hopefully continued influx of white people calling together white people, right, to have a conversation about what's happening and what that looks like, there are spaces that we can do as well. And for myself as a Black woman, for sure.
Thank you. In terms of where do we go from here, what is next? I would like to go back to some of the points that Tanji made. I've got some homework, and I would like to invite us all also to ask ourselves about this personal agency and identity affirmation. Personal agency. We hear from staff of color that they are not being heard, they are not feeling heard, they are being pushed out, their statements are pushed out of the way. How can white folks, those of you who are here, how can we support staff? How do we stand alongside staff? When we speak about identity affirmation, I laugh because this is my clothing most of the time. These are my shirts from Michoacan. These are my flowers that my mother made. I am wearing my earrings that were made by an artesano in Michoacan that have the hummingbirds that represent my grandmother. I wore it all today because I needed all of my ancestors and my grandmother with me for this conversation. I could not sleep last night. I was thinking of all of the comments that I have read and heard of folks that are hurting, of folks that have been hurt, of folks that are shushed, pushed away, of the managers that say it doesn't happen here. We stand by all people. The harm that causes. This is me. This is all of me. I have been undocumented. I have had to pretend to be non-undocumented. I had to learn to hide my accent. I had to learn to speak correctly so that when I was detained, I could say that I am from Idaho and I grew up in Idaho and that's where all my family's from. I was 14 and undocumented. And I still feel that sometimes working when someone questions or someone looks at if I wrote a proposal and there's red all over it, I hear the voice of you are not good enough. You are not professional enough. How are we supporting the identities, because we have multiple of our staff? How are we standing up for people of color at our organization, for Black folks? How are we staying true to our values? I now feel beautifully blessed to be working at the partnership where the statement that was sent out was shared with all staff first. We provided input. It was shared with board members. We all provided some input to it. We needed to have a conversation of, is this something that we can all stand by? Do we all understand what this means and where we're going? Do we all understand our values and our mission? These conversations need to be had, not just with leadership, not just with the board of directors. Everyone needs to be engaged in these conversations.
I have a question. Hi.
Hi.
I want to be part of this conversation. That's why I turned my mic on. So I'm just a crisis line volunteer at my organization at this point, but I'm also a student at Sac State. And I want to be a better ally for people of color. And I'm doing things like educating myself and reading books and listening and, all the things. But sometimes I feel like because of the, decades and decades of oppression, people of color, they may be scared to actually say what's going on for them. And I want to go to people of color and say, if you have something to say, I would really like to hear you. But I also don't want to out somebody who doesn't feel comfortable. So I guess I'm wondering, is that an appropriate thing to do, or how can I navigate that? Because I really do want to show up and help change what's going on right now.
I think it really
Go for it, Tanji.
It starts with you. It starts with self. I think once white folks wake up to white privilege and realize that systemic oppression is real and that folks are still feeling the weight of slavery generations later, still feeling the weight of Jim Crow generations later, it might feel like, okay, I have to jump in and do. And I want to bring again that idea of saving. The saving is not what is necessary. It takes internal work. It's way more important and valuable to have conversations with your community and people, your loved ones, people are directly within your community, people that are around you, and make sure that you all on the same page, as opposed to doing things to try to save Black folks from systemic oppression, because the racism and oppression only thrives because people have those attitudes. So it's internal work that we have to start with first and approach it as a partnership. People have their own experiences, and just because someone is Black does not mean that they even always feel oppressed. Sometimes we even do things by equating Blackness with poverty, or Blackness with being a criminal, or Blackness with living in the hood, but that's not the reality for everyone. So we can't treat Black people as monoliths either, or feel like, okay, I understand that these are the struggles of Black people. That's not true, because it's an individual person, and they have their own experience. So how can you engage in dialogue? And dialogue is not just speaking, it's also listening too. And maybe they don't even need your help or support. Maybe they just want to be able to have the opportunity to help and support themselves. So the savior mentality has to be first addressed, because to me that feels sometimes like guilt, or like I have to do something that's right, but we can't work from a place of guilt. We have to work from a place of rightness and of belonging. Because when you have that guilt, it creates another othering. It creates this idea that you are needed in order to make that change, which is true, but you are not the catalyst for that change. We are all a part of that. And people really have to understand what their role is. And your role might be just to educate the people who are in your neighborhood and your family members. And that's how you contribute. And that is enough. It doesn't have to be saving the entire population of Black folks from systemic oppression. That's the job of lawmakers. That's the job of people who are creating policies. That's the job of law enforcement. They have those roles to do things like that. But you have to just figure out what works best without thinking you have to save everyone, because some people are really not even trying to be saved. You know, I think even through this movie, you have to remember some Black folks are more comfortable with less people even knowing about Black cultural things because they feel sacred. And you have to be okay with that too. So it's a lot more of the internal work and realizing what impact you can make in what way. And I feel like you have to save everything, because it can start to feel more about yourself and less about supporting and breaking these systems.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a question of, I know we are at 12:37. And again, I did share at the very beginning, and I do want to respect folks' time. I recognize that if you need to get off, please do so. We understand that. And if folks are able to stay on for another 10, 15 minutes, we can do that. We understand that this is a space that folks are needing and have questions. There is a question about passing the mic. How can you pass the mic without tokenizing, triggering, putting the spotlight on someone? What does that look like? Thoughts?
Hi everyone, this is Jackie. I've been typing furiously into the chat, but I did want to address that in terms of passing the mic. I think that, I put on the chat that I felt like building trust with those folks first before passing the mic is incredibly essential. And also please know that for many of us, people of color in this field, we have been told that we have the authority or the ability to speak, but then we are censored, or we are edited, or we are, that it doesn't materialize in the way that we envisioned it. So as you're building relationships and as you're building trust with people of color, please know that we might not trust you for a minute. It might take a while. So, and be okay with that. Just be okay. You have to, don't take it personally that this is not about you as an individual. It's not about not trusting you as a person. It's about not trusting the fact that we are all currently living and working in this system that does disproportionately affect the way that we do our work as people of color. And so just be patient with that. I would say one of the best things that I've ever experienced was having a white colleague who was like, you're not normally in these meetings, but I'm bringing you with me. And before the meeting, we strategize. It's like organizing 101, right? We strategize who's going to be in the room. What are the pushback that we are going to expect? How do we handle that pushback? How can we have folks in the room who are going to be allies, but maybe not necessarily like outward allies, but who can support and elevate the work that, or the words that we are saying, right? So there's like the meeting before the meeting, then there's the meeting, and then the meeting after the meeting to figure out what you're going to do differently next time. But those are some of the ways that I think passing the mic has been incredibly helpful. And just know it might take a while to actually gain folks' trust, rightfully so.
Thank you, Jackie. I'm also hearing from folks on surveys for all staff, but please find a way for them to actually be confidential, and then actually doing something about the responses you get from an all staff survey. Also, another kind reminder, we all process differently, so please, when a question is asked, allow for 15 to 30 seconds or even more for folks to think about what they're going to say, because we do process differently. So there are folks that need more time to be able to get their comment out. And the reminder for people of color folks, hold on, you don't have to be the first person to answer. Talia and Timisa, you wanted to say something?
Yeah.
Is it Talia?
Oh, go ahead. No, Talia, go ahead.
It's Talia.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I wanted to speak up also just because I feel like, lately I have been speaking up about the Black Lives Matter movement and all that. And I feel like the information or I don't know if it's information, but the stuff I'm getting, the feedback I'm getting is more like you're coming off as like sounding a little bit racist or like you're hating on white people. But I feel like that's also part of like the white privilege, that they're so closed-minded and they're unaware that they've been privileged for so long, and that, we're finally speaking up about these issues that have been happening for so long. And so I feel like, there's no good way of putting the stuff that people have been experiencing, like people of color, Black people, Latinos, what we've experienced, like there's no good way of putting it without like sounding like upset about it. I feel like some people want us to sensitize it and to minimize like the experiences that we've gone through. Just because, I've gone through stuff too myself and my family. I have people that are undocumented. So it is uncomfortable to speak up about your personal experiences, and also experiences like with the people that we're serving in our community. I'm in a small town where I grew up with like majority of the people being Latinos or Asians and white. We didn't really see any Black people growing up. There was probably like one family when I was growing up. So then, as the years go on, like we're starting to see like my community becoming a little bit more diverse now. And so I think it's just breaking those barriers and, having those uncomfortable conversations. And there's like no way of putting it to sensitize it and to be like, let's just have this conversation, like, like nothing. But it's sitting down and really like listening to everybody's point of view, just because, again, we've all grown up so differently. People have grown up with privileges. And I was fortunate enough that my parents encouraged me to go to college. I didn't have their support growing up like that, where they were like, I'll help you get there. It was just like, you're expected to go to college and you're going to figure it out. And that's what I did, And I feel like that's me wanting it. So I made it happen for myself, and not everybody has that same opportunity. And I think that's part of the conversation that we need to have as well with other people, because people are saying like, you have this opportunity, you can get out of where you are. But it's like, no, it's having those connections and being able to work with people and have those mentors that, we spoke about earlier in this webinar. It's having those mentors and those connections to kind of get us out of that spot. But again, it's being mindful that not everybody has those opportunities. So I just wanted to put in my 2 cents, and that's it. Thanks.
Gracias, Talia. Timisa.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to add that even in spaces that are passing the mic, understanding people of color are not Black people only. I want to highlight that there's a Native experience, that there is a Latino experience and a Black experience. And so as we just talk about people of color, I want to be clear too, as we are having different conversations, that if we are talking about a Black issue, it might not conjoin with people of color. As we all, I just want to be clear that we all have different experiences in culture that must be highlighted. And as many of you highlighted, that we cannot put it all together like this is all Black people's experiences and this is how they're going to navigate through this. A friend of mine, and I can pass on the article to you, just to add on here, I don't have it in front of me. Just recently did a blog that was called Don't Be an Ally. And what that talked about, it was really powerful, but it talked about what kind of ally are you, knowing what kind you are. Are you just for this season, or we need allies who are abolitionists if that is where you are, like this is an ongoing thing, an ongoing conversation. It is just not in the meantime for a hashtag or just to have that conversation and then you're done. So as many of you echoed today, I echo the same sentiments that we have to continue to have these conversations and not a training, 1 or 2 trainings as a check off the box is not going to do. It has to be, what are the actions after that to really bring forth inclusive change, but also ultimately liberation. So I thank you all, the panelists, all for your time and this powerful platform. It was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there other questions, thoughts?
Hi, I just wanted just to say thank you so much for this space. This is a lot. It's just a lot more than what I was expecting, and especially hearing a lot of women of color. I'm also a Mexicana over here, immigrant, and so everyone's stories have just been really, really helpful because I sometimes you just feel a little bit alone, especially when you come. I live in a really conservative, small white community. So, you know, we also had a local young man who lost a life. And it is scary to show up in a small town. But it is also healing to be out there and just know that it's that I'm not alone in feeling just the panic of people just being so comfortable. And you know, it's difficult to even see like my own friends sometimes, just not even one post, but there's 1,000 food posts. I mean, just nothing has really changed and what they prioritize. So. Thank you.
Gracias, Aide. You are not alone. I am so sorry that you are in a space where you feel unsafe, and I've heard the struggle of being in a small rural community, of having organizations that say it's okay for you to show up to the Women's March, but you can't go to the Racial Justice March. You can't go to the Black Lives March, at least not during work hours. It's not allyship. That's not intersectionality. And our work is intersectional. And we are going to continue having these conversations. It is essential that we continue educating each other, dismantling the oppression that shows up in our work, and we're going to do it together. We had over 300 folks show up today. We have so many more in our organizations that we need to get to. And I felt that all of us are in this together, and we're learning, and there's folks that remained quiet. I heard from folks that said today, I am listening, I am learning. We thank you. I am so appreciative of Tanji and Kolsaria for sharing their vulnerability, their honesty, their suggestions of how we can hold ourselves accountable across our field, across our organizations, across our families. Thank you. Closing thoughts, Kolsaria and Tanji?
I would just thank you. Thank you for making the space for this, Alejandra. And I know it's hard to connect with everything going on, but I'm so thrilled to be here. There are some books that have changed my life. Pretty much everything by Bell Hooks, by the way. So you can't go wrong. So if you're looking for things, particularly as we talk about radical love, right, of our communities, of each other, Beth Ritchie's Arrested Justice is an amazing book to start that really thinks about Black women and violence, and really it starts to work on the systems of oppression, and that includes the criminal justice system, right? And yeah, I would encourage people who want to read. I would encourage people to also not get stuck in just your feelings. This has to be a time of action or it will be missed. And so if we don't actually do something with this, then it will not help. It is not an ally. It is not, we need to actually move into action, and you can do that while you're reading. You don't have to wait until you've read everything and heard everything in order to do that. And I'm just so thankful to be here and so honored to be a part of this conversation. And I'm not perfect. My organization is not perfect. We have a lot of work to do. It is an ongoing journey. And I think if you're committed to it, it can happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Kolsaria.
I'd like to just say thank you all for coming here and showing up and being here. Again, by you just showing up, you're showing that you want to be a part of that change. We have such a beautiful, perfect time to pivot ourselves into a way of justice and liberation. And it's encouraging to know that so many advocates are wanting to be a part of that process and willing to put their neck out in order to do it, which is necessary and needed. So thank you all for that. I also want to just shamelessly plug 1124. If you like prevention work, please come talk to me, because that is really the work that I live for and I love to do. I'm doing a webinar with Jane Doe around people of color, young people of color and media literacy. It's a part 2 and 3. So we've done part 1 that's on YouTube, and coming up, we're gonna do 2 parts of it. So this is a way that you can practically add in social liberation, racial justice into your prevention work through media literacy. So if you are wanting to learn more, it's like a link right now. I don't have it, but I will share it with you all. Well, I'll share with Alejandra and Miranda so they can pass it around. But yeah, please join. Continue to learn. Continue to be on that wave. Be gentle and kind with yourself, because doing this work is not easy. Don't work from a place of guilt, only from a place of belonging. And thank you all again for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Miranda, for adding the link into the chat. Please keep an eye out for the partnership website. It's cpedv.org. I've got to plug, Jessica Merrill is our communications manager, and she is a phenomenal ally, advocate, activist. She hears, listens, responds, acts, shows up. Jess is continuously adding information on our website. You can go cpedv.org/prevention. We are going to be adding this information on there, along with resources to read, to access. There are also graphics that we are working on that are going to be addressing the intersectionality of our work. Jess, love you so much. Thank you for always showing up for prevention, for always showing up for racial justice. And just love you all. Kolsaria, thank you so much. Badass woman, you have engaged, empowered, fill us up with so much hope, and you are doing the work, and just want to say thank you for what you do. Take care of you, and so much love for you. Hermana, te puedo llamar hermana, thank you. Tanji, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for speaking up about intersectionality from such a beautiful space, for using the images of a Black youth that empowers all of us. If there is something that is engaging and an activist, it's a youth. Youth challenge things. Youth challenge norms, break boundaries. Boundaries, the ones that are harmful, okay? Not the boundaries that are ours. No, no, no. Youth are all about challenging systems and creating radical change. And I love the images that you choose and how you engage us in being thoughtful and reminding ourselves to bring our whole selves to the conversation. Thank you so much for being here with us. And we're going to keep this conversation going. We have over 360 people who want to do that. So thank you so much. Thank you for the partnership leadership for supporting all of this. We thank you all, and Prevention Peer Network is here for you. Please stay in touch. We are going to continue sharing information. Take care of you, stay safe, stay healthy. We will be in touch. Gracias. Yes, the recording will be made available. We will have it on our website, and we will share information out with folks. Rebecca.
There's proof of me getting crazy, really? Just delete it, you know?
You did not get crazy.
You know me too well.
Let me stop the recording.